The morning Thornfield Hall changed hands. Nobody thought to tell the girl who had grown up inside its walls. Lena heard it the way she heard most things that season. Secondhand, too late, standing in a corridor she no longer had any right to stand in. One of the kitchen maids said it to another in the sort of loud whisper that wasn't meant to be quiet at all. The new Duke had arrived, the Duke of Ashbourne. He had come up from London the previous evening, in the rain, with very little luggage and no announcement. The staff had scrambled. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, had lit fires in rooms that hadn't been opened in 2 years. Lena set down the bucket she was carrying and stood very still. He was here then. Cassian Aldermere, the Duke of Ashbourne, her father's ward. The man who, by the terms of a will that Lena still did not fully understand and had not been given the chance to contest, now owned everything that had once been hers. She picked up the bucket again and kept walking. That was the thing about being invisible. You had to keep moving. She had been Lena Poole for 4 months now. That was what the other servants called her. They assumed she was some relation of the housekeeper, a niece or a goddaughter, brought in to help when the estate passed from her father's hands into the solicitor's, and then, eventually, into the Duke's. Mrs. Poole, who had known Lena since she was 3 years old, had agreed to the arrangement without much argument. She was a practical woman. She understood that a young woman with no money and a disputed inheritance had very few options, and that being inside the house was better than being outside it. The legal matter was this. Lena's father, Sir Edmund Poole, no relation to the housekeeper, the shared name was coincidence and a useful one, had died 14 months ago, and his will had contained a clause that his solicitor, Mr. Dace, had explained to Lena in the flat voice of a man delivering news he found personally inconvenient. The estate could not pass to a daughter unless she was married. In the event of no marriage, the estate would pass to the nearest male relative or, failing that, to whomever Sir Edmund had named in a secondary provision. He had named Cassian Aldermere, a ward, her father had always said. A young man I took an interest in. He had spoken of him occasionally, with a sort of measured approval. Lena had formed no picture of him. She had not needed to. She needed to now. The Duke had been in residence for 3 days before Lena saw him properly. She passed him once at the end of a hallway, a tall figure in a dark coat, standing at the window that looked out over the east garden, his back to her. She had turned and gone the other way without making a sound. She was good at that. 4 months of practice. It was Mrs. Poole who told her things. In the evenings after supper, when the kitchen was quiet and the other staff had gone to their rooms, Lena would sit at the long wooden table with a cup of tea she didn't always finish, and Mrs. Poole would talk. He had arrived with almost nothing, Mrs. Poole said. A single trunk and a leather satchel, and a man named Garvey, who served as his secretary and seemed deeply unhappy about the relocation from London. The Duke himself had said very little. He had walked the house the first morning, room by room, slowly, as if taking an inventory of something he wasn't sure he wanted. He had stood for a long time in Sir Edmund's study. He had not come out for almost an hour. "What was he doing in there?" Lena asked. "I don't know," Mrs. Poole said. "He didn't ask for anything. He just stood." Lena thought about her father's study, the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco that had never quite aired out, even after all the windows were opened. The small watercolor of the Northumberland coast above the mantelpiece that her mother had painted before Lena was born. She wondered if it was still there. She didn't ask. The 4th day she was reassigned to the upper floors. It was a straightforward piece of bad luck. One of the upstairs maids had sprained her wrist, and Mrs. Poole needed someone to cover the east wing. She looked at Lena across the kitchen table with an expression that said she understood the difficulty and had considered it, and had concluded there was no other option. "Keep your cap on," Mrs. Poole said, "and if he speaks to you, answer plainly and move on." Lena nodded. She had always been told she didn't look much like her father. She had her mother's coloring, light brown hair, pale eyes, a face that strangers found difficult to place, neither striking nor forgettable. Simply there. It was a face that had frustrated her as a girl when she had wanted to be remarkable. Now she was grateful for it. The east wing in the morning was cold and gray and smelled of the fires that had only recently been lit after months of disuse. Lena worked quietly. She had learned over 4 months to move in a way that took up very little space, to close doors softly, to carry things without the small sounds, the clink, the scrape, the footfall that announced a person's presence. She was in the corridor outside the library when the library door opened. Cassian Aldermere was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Someone larger, perhaps, or louder. Someone who occupied space the way men who had recently inherited large estates sometimes did, with a kind of territorial ease. He was tall, yes, but he stood in the doorway as if he wasn't entirely sure of his welcome there. His face was, she noted this quickly, professionally, the way she noted everything now, tired. Not from lack of sleep, or not only that, something older than sleep. He looked at her. Lena looked back, kept her expression neutral, and moved to step around him. "Excuse me," she said. "Wait," she stopped. "You're one of Mrs. Poole's," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment. Not the way some men studied servants, that sliding, dismissive look that went past you like you were furniture. He actually looked, which was somehow more uncomfortable. "What's your name?" "Lena, Your Grace." A pause. "Have you been here long?" "Some months." He nodded, as if this answered something, though she couldn't imagine what. Then he stepped back into the library, and the door closed, and Lena stood in the corridor for exactly 2 seconds before continuing down the hall. That night she told Mrs. Poole. The older woman listened, poured more tea, and said, "He asked questions like that. Short ones. He asked me yesterday how long I'd been here and whether I'd known Sir Edmund well. What did you tell him?" "The truth. 22 years, and yes." Mrs. Poole set down the teapot. He listened. He didn't ask anything else. Lena thought about that. "He seems..." She stopped. "What?" She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Not what she'd imagined. Quieter, more careful. "Nothing," she said. She had come to Thornfield with a plan. It was not a complicated plan, but it was the only one available to her. She needed to find the letter. Her father had written to her 3 weeks before he died. She had not received the letter until 4 months after his death, forwarded from her aunt's house in Edinburgh, where she'd been staying. Her aunt had kept it by mistake, she said, or hadn't noticed it, or some other explanation that didn't entirely hold together. By the time Lena had it in her hands, the estate had already passed. Mr. Dace had already filed the necessary documents. The Duke had already been contacted. The letter itself was partial, water damaged along one edge, the ink gone in places. But what she could read was enough to make her certain that her father had intended to change things. There was a reference to a second document. A codicil, he called it. He said he had left it with his papers. He said he had been meaning to speak to Mr. Dace, but had not yet done so. He had not gotten the chance. The codicil, if it existed, would be in his study. Mr. Dace either didn't know about it or didn't want to. Either way, Lena was not going to find help there. She was going to have to find it herself, which meant getting into the study, which meant being inside the house, which meant being Lena Poole, niece of nobody, carrying buckets and keeping her head down. The study was in the east wing. The Duke used it every morning. This was the difficulty she had not anticipated. She had assumed, when she'd made her plan in the cold sitting room of her aunt's Edinburgh house, with Otter, the letter spread out on the table in front of her, that the Duke would be in London, that he would take possession of the estate in the technical sense, and leave the actual house to be managed from a distance, that she would have time and quiet and access. She had 3 out of 4 months of quiet access before he arrived. She had searched the study twice, carefully, without finding anything, but the study was full of papers. Her father had been a methodical man who kept everything, and the filing had become disordered in the months between his death and the Duke's arrival, and she had not been able to look for long on either occasion without the risk of being found. Now there was a Duke in the room every morning, and her options had narrowed considerably. She thought about this for a week. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, she did something that was either very sensible or very foolish. She knocked on the study door. "Come in." He was at the desk, writing. He looked up when she entered. "Your Grace," Lena said. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to ask about the filing in the lower cabinet. Some of the papers seem to be in need of sorting. I was told," she had prepared this, had rehearsed it, "that Sir Edmund's system was particular, and that it would help to have them put back in order before anything was misfiled or lost." He looked at her. "Who told you that?" A small pause. Mrs. Poole mentioned it. He considered this. "The filing in the lower cabinet. Yes, you want to sort it, if your Grace has no objection." Another pause. He set down his pen. "When? In the afternoons, while you are not using the room. I would not disturb the upper desk." He looked at her for a moment with that same careful attention that she was beginning to find distinctly inconvenient. Most people, most employers, in her limited experience of being employed, looked at servants without really seeing them. He did not do that. "All right," he said at last, "in the afternoons. Thank you, Your Grace." She turned to go. "Lena," she stopped. "If you find anything unusual," he said, "I'd like to know." She turned back to look at him. His expression was difficult to read. "Of course," she said. She left. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall for a moment and breathed. He did not mean the codicil. He couldn't mean the codicil. He didn't know about it. She was almost certain he didn't know about it. She began working in the study on Friday afternoons. She was methodical about it, genuinely sorting the papers as she went, because she was actually a reasonably good archivist. Her father had taught her his system when she was 12, sitting beside her at this same desk, and because the work had to look legitimate. She found the codicil on the 3rd Friday. It was inside a green Morocco portfolio that had been pushed to the very back of the lowest drawer, behind a ledger of household accounts from 7 years ago. The portfolio was tied with a faded ribbon, and her name was written on the outside in her father's handwriting. Her name. Her real name. She stood very still for a long moment. Outside, she could hear rain beginning against the windows. The fire had burned low. She was alone in the room. She untied the ribbon and opened the portfolio. The codicil was there. 3 pages, signed and dated and witnessed by a man named Mr. Fenn, who she did not recognize. It stated, clearly and without ambiguity, that in the event of Sir Edmund's death, Thornfield Hall and its attached properties were to pass to his daughter Lena, to be administered in trust, until such time as she married or reached the age of 30, at which point she would have full and unconditional ownership. There was also a letter. 4 pages this time, and dry, and complete. She read it twice, standing at the cabinet with the rain on the windows, and then she sat down on the floor because her legs had stopped cooperating. Her father had not forgotten her. He had not overlooked her or underestimated her or decided she was less important than the legal conventions of inheritance. He had simply been too ill too quickly, and Mr. Dace had not been informed, and the portfolio had been pushed to the back of the drawer, and the wrong will had been filed. She held the papers in her lap for a long time. The door opened. She had not heard him on the stairs. She had not heard anything. He was simply there, in the doorway, and she was on the floor of his study, with a green portfolio open across her knees, and her father's letter in her hands, and there was no version of this moment that she could explain away. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression did not change. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "What is that?" he said. His voice was even. Lena made a decision. It was not a complicated decision in the end. There was nothing else to do. She got up off the floor. "My name," she said, "is not Lena Poole." She straightened her apron, which was a slightly absurd thing to do under the circumstances, but she needed a moment. "My name is Lena Ashbourne. I am Sir Edmund's daughter." She held out the portfolio. "And I believe this belongs to me." He did not take it. He stood very still, looking at her, and then he looked at the portfolio, and then he looked back at her face. He stayed like that for a long moment. "Sit down," he said at last. She sat. He sat across from her, in the chair her father had always used, and he held out his hand for the portfolio. She gave it to him. He read in silence, all 3 pages of the codicil, and then he read her father's letter, and he read it more slowly than she expected, which she noticed without being able to explain why she noticed it. When he finished, he set the papers down on the desk. "Why didn't you go to the solicitor?" he said. "Because Mr. Dace filed the wrong will. Knowingly or not, I can't prove either way. But he is not going to be the one who puts things right. Why didn't you come to me directly?" She looked at him. "Because I had no reason to trust you." He received this without visible reaction. "And now?" he said. "I still have very little reason to trust you," she said. "But you've read the document and you're still in the room, so—" Something moved in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. "Your father," he said, "wrote to me as well, before he died." Lena went still. "He told me about you. He told me quite a lot about you." He paused. "He also told me that he was concerned the legal arrangements might not proceed cleanly. He said, I'm paraphrasing, that if something went wrong with the paperwork, he trusted me to make it right." The room was very quiet. "You knew," Lena said. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what. I've spent 3 months in this house and in London trying to find out what." He glanced at the portfolio. "I didn't know where to look." Lena thought about all the Friday afternoons, the permission he had given her so readily, the question he had asked her on her way out, "If you find anything unusual, I'd like to know." "You were looking too," she said. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. "You should have said something." "You should have said something," he said. A silence. And then, she couldn't help it, she laughed. It came out unsteady, a little too sharp, but it was real. He looked at her when she laughed, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something open and unprepared. "I'm sorry," she said, pressing her hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry. I'm not, no, don't," he said, and his voice had shifted, gentled in some way. "I understand." She took a breath. 4 months, she said. "I spent 4 months sorting papers in my own father's house, pretending to be someone I wasn't. And you were looking for the same thing." "Yes, that's—" She stopped. "Absurd," he offered. "I was going to say something less polite." He said nothing, but that thing near a smile was there again, and she noted it, and then immediately stopped noting it, because she had other things to think about. He sent for Mr. Dace the following morning. Lena was not present for that meeting, but she was present when it ended, because she was in the corridor, and the Duke came out of the study. With a look on his face that she was beginning to recognize, calm, contained, the surface giving nothing away, but something underneath it that was working very hard. "It will take some time," he said. "He's resistant. But the codicil is witnessed and dated and entirely in order, and there's no credible argument against it." Lena nodded. "Weeks, not months," he said. "Possibly as little as 2 weeks if we push." She nodded again. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" She thought about that question. The same one he'd asked her, in different language, the very first time they'd spoken properly. Not "what do you need?" or "is there anything I can do?" but simply, "Are you all right?" The exact question, said plainly. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's honest." "Yes." He nodded. He turned to go. She watched him walk down the corridor and thought that she had spent 4 months building a careful and specific picture of Cassian Aldermere as an adversary, as someone she was working against, and that the picture needed substantial revision. That afternoon she went to the East Garden. It was early April, cold still, the kind of cold that came off the moor in long flat waves. She sat on the stone bench by the yew hedge, the one where she had done her lessons as a girl, while her father read nearby and pretended he wasn't watching to make sure she actually worked. She had always known he was watching. She had never told him she knew. It had been their arrangement. She heard footsteps on the gravel path. She didn't turn around, because she already knew who it was. There was only one other person who came to the East Garden. He sat on the bench beside her, not too close. For a while neither of them said anything. The moor stretched out beyond the garden wall. The sky was gray and enormous. A crow crossed it, unhurried. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Did you want the house?" A pause. "No," he said. "No. I have a house in London. I have no particular attachment to the country." Another pause. "Your father was. He was kind to me when I was young, at a time when kindness was not something I encountered very often. I didn't want his estate. I wanted to honor what he asked of me." Lena looked out at the moor. "And what he asked of you was to find the codicil. What he asked of me," he said, "was to look after his daughter." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't need looking after," she said. "I know. I found the codicil myself. I know that too." She glanced at him. He was looking out at the garden, his hands resting on his knees, his face in profile. He looked. She reached for the word and found it, settled, as if the conversation was not difficult, as if sitting in a cold East Garden with a woman who had spent 4 months deceiving him was a perfectly reasonable way to spend an afternoon. "I should have come to you sooner," she said. "Probably." He paused. "But I understand why you didn't. Do you?" He turned to look at her. "You had very little reason to trust me," he said. "You said so? And now?" He held her gaze. "That's your question to answer, not mine." The garden was quiet. Somewhere beyond the wall, a sheep called out once and then stopped. The cold had settled into a particular quality of stillness that Lena associated with this part of the country, with this garden, with childhood afternoons, and the smell of her father's pipe and the scratch of a pen on paper. She felt, for the first time in 14 months, something loosen inside her chest. Not gone, not fixed, but loosened. 2 weeks later, Mr. Dace filed the corrected documentation with an expression of extreme personal suffering and no further legal resistance. The codicil was registered. The solicitor's office sent a letter that was technically correct in every particular and radiated resentment from every line. Lena read it at the kitchen table, still wearing her work apron, because some habits were slow to leave. Mrs. Poole poured tea and did not say anything, which was its own kind of eloquence. Thornfield Hall was hers. She spent the afternoon walking through it. She had walked through it hundreds of times, of course, thousands of times. But this was different. She walked slowly, room by room, the way she had been told the Duke had walked it when he first arrived, and she understood now what that had been. Not possession, inventory, trying to understand what you'd been left with. She came to her father's study last. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. The watercolor of the Northumberland coast was still above the mantelpiece. Her mother's handwriting in the lower right corner, small and precise, June 1849. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the desk in the exact same angle she remembered. She stepped inside. She sat down in her father's chair, and put her hands flat on the surface of the desk and stayed like that for a while. There was a knock at the open door. She knew the knock. "Come in," she said. He stopped just inside the door, the way he always did, as if checking that entry was welcome. She had noticed this about him, that he never simply walked into rooms, even rooms that had been his. He had spent 3 months in this house and he was still asking permission. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. She had known this was coming. The legal matter was resolved. He had no reason to stay. "Back to London?" "Yes." She nodded. "I'll have Mrs. Poole see to the rooms." "That's not?" He stopped. A pause. "I wanted to say goodbye properly, before." She looked at him. He was standing in the afternoon light, his coat somewhat the worse for 4 months in the country, his expression doing that thing she had learned to read, contained, careful, something working quietly underneath. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. You did, though." "What?" my father asked. "You stayed until it was resolved. It seemed right. It was right." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'm not entirely certain I would have found the codicil without the afternoons you gave me. You would have found it eventually." "Maybe." She paused. "But probably not before I drove myself mad trying." He smiled. "A real one, not the near-miss version." She had seen 2 or 3 of those now, and she had catalogued them with more attention than she was comfortable admitting. He stayed standing. She stayed sitting. "You could come back," she said. "When you're in the north, the house has more rooms than I'll ever use." He looked at her. Something shifted. "That's a generous offer," he said. "It's a practical one." She kept her voice level. "You knew my father. You knew this house before I came back to it. There's something steady about that." She paused. "Also, Mrs. Poole seems to approve of you, and she doesn't approve of many people. High recommendation." "The highest." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back and did not look away, which was its own kind of statement. "Then I'll come back," he said. "When I'm in the north." "Good." He lingered a moment longer. She thought he might say something else. He didn't. He inclined his head, a small and precise gesture, and turned to leave. "Cassian." He stopped. She hadn't used his name before. She had been careful about that, even after everything. He turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for looking." He looked at her across the length of her father's study, in the afternoon light coming through the old window, and said, "Thank you for finding it." Then he left. She sat at the desk for a while after the sound of his footsteps had faded. She looked at her mother's watercolor. She looked at her hands on the wood. Outside, the moor was going purple in the late day light, that color that had no real name, that she had spent her whole childhood staring at, and never quite being able to describe. She thought about a man who had spent 3 months in a house he didn't want, looking for a document he hadn't been told about, for a girl he'd never met. She thought about spring, and the north, and someone who knocked before entering. She picked up her father's pen and opened the household ledger to a clean page, and she began, for the first time in 14 months, to make plans.